Students, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed your dinner. We are going to go ahead and get started with our keynote speech for the night, and it is my immense pleasure to introduce Liz Wheeler. Liz Wheeler is unapologetically one of the conservative movement's boldest voices. In Politico's words, Liz is a titan of media, and she's just getting started. Blocked by AOC, demonetized on Facebook, and whispered about at the Snopes water cooler, Liz Wheeler is undeterred, maybe even energized. As the host of The Liz Wheeler Show, one of the year's most highly anticipated new podcasts, Liz is a voice of reason for millions of Americans as she guides them through the most important stories that no one else is telling. Liz is passionate about telling the truth, rigorous in her research, and committed to her faith. Her drive to relentlessly defend against the radical leftist takeover of our culture is born of a desire to see properly ordered society thrive in America once again. A society that values God over government, freedom over convenience, and individual liberty over victimhood and identity politics. Liz became a household name in 2015 when she debuted as the host of cable's highly rated Tipping Point with Liz Wheeler program, which broadcast every night in a prime time slot on One American News. In this post, Liz cemented her place in America's political landscape, speaking to hundreds of millions of people each year and delivering the undiluted truth about everything from communism to COVID. This year, in partnership with the premium podcast creative company Soundfront, Liz announced that she would become the host of The Liz Wheeler Show, a new video podcast that would go on to immediately develop a nationwide following spanning the spectrums of age, geography, sex, and even political affiliation. 3 times each week, viewers across America trust Liz to uncomplicate what the mainstream media has obfuscated. The Liz Wheeler Show is a personal, researched, and unapologetic take on how we think about our culture, or what's left of it. I've been a fan of Liz Wheeler's for a long time, and so I'm really excited to welcome her tonight. Please join me in welcoming Liz Wheeler.
Hello, good evening. How are we tonight? Well, that's what I like to hear. Thank you so much for having me. It's my honor to be here. We ran into some travel snafus, and it took us about almost 2 days to get here. And I said to my husband as we were sitting in the airport at all hours, I would not do this for anybody other than YAF, and especially the high school conference, because you guys are my favorite people to talk to. So, thank you, Madison, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you. I know Governor Walker had to leave, but thank you, Governor Walker, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. It's so encouraging and wonderful to see so many young people wanting to stand up for conservative values and learn how to be the next generation of freedom fighters. So, again, like I said, you're my favorite to talk to. I wanted to start out tonight just by telling a little story. I typically travel, or I have been, at least this summer, I travel with my daughter, who is 9 months old. She travels with me because I can't bear to leave her behind. And when we were spending time in the airport these last 2 days, I think it was in Phoenix, although I'm not sure at this point which airport it was, there was a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, dressed up in a Cinderella dress, gowned all the way to the floor. She had the tiara on, she had the magic wand, and she was just living her best life, as they say. And my daughter, again, 9 months old, can't walk, can't talk, was absolutely mesmerized with this little girl. So mesmerized. I mean, I was holding her and she was doing that lean to look at this little girl. Just truly fascinated. And at the same time, I saw a family with 2 little boys walk by. These 2 little boys were about the same age as Cinderella, and they didn't even give her a glance. They were completely disinterested. And I thought to myself, this is a perfect illustration of the opposite of what the left tells us, because the left tells us that gender is a social construct. And I thought to myself, no, My daughter was fascinated with the Cinderella ball gown because she's a girl. She's 9 months old, but because she's a girl. And of course, this was obvious when she was born for obvious reasons. The doctor knew she was a girl. The midwife knew she was a girl. I knew she was a girl. My husband knew she was a girl. In fact, I'm a very impatient person by nature. And of course, I found out the gender before she was born. I couldn't wait. I couldn't even wait until the ultrasound that would show her. I did the blood test where they test my blood and they look for the DNA of the baby in your blood. It's a relatively new development. I didn't actually know about it until I was pregnant. And if they find male DNA in the mom's blood, then it indicates that your baby's a boy, because otherwise, why would I have male DNA in my blood? And if they, right. And if they don't find male DNA, then it's a girl, because there's little traces of the baby's DNA in your blood. So we've known since about 2, 3, 4 weeks after I found out that I was pregnant that she was a girl. And as I said, sitting in the airport, watching this happen, watching my daughter be mesmerized by Cinderella, and knowing that it's not because she's seen the movie, she's 9 months. I mean, she hasn't seen any of that yet. It's just because this is innate to what it means to be a female, to recognize, beautiful things, beautiful women, a princess. I mean, this is part of what it means to be a girl. And all I kept thinking about was the congressional hearing of Dr. Rachel Levine. Do you guys know who Dr. Rachel Levine is? So Dr. Rachel Levine was the former health secretary in the state of Pennsylvania. Dr. Rachel Levine identifies as transgender. This individual was born male and transitioned to a female, hence the name Dr. Rachel Levine, is now second in command at Health and Human Services, the undersecretary or the deputy secretary of Health and Human Services under Javier Becerra. And Dr. Rachel Levine was recently awarded a 3-star admiralship of the U.S. Public Health Commissioned Corps, I believe it's called. And I was scrolling through my phone the other day when this happened, and I saw headlines about it. But the headlines weren't simply announcing, oh, okay, this is another Biden administration pick that's relatively radical or that was elevated to this position. No. The headlines about Dr. Rachel Levine said, first female 3-star admiral. And so I'm sitting in the airport again. My mind goes off on these trains, but all I could think of when I see my daughter looking at this princess, I think of this man who identifies as a woman who has taken opportunity and achievement away from these little girls. And I thought to myself, this is one of the reasons why my generation and your generation, young people, even though the topic can be somewhat uncomfortable, why it is so incumbent on us to reject the transgender ideology. Because at the end of the day, and we're going to get into what I mean in just a second, but at the end of the day, the transgender ideology is a lie. And it's not just a lie to individuals who suffer from gender dysphoria. It's a lie to every little girl and boy in our country. It's a lie to your sisters and brothers. It's a lie to you. It's a lie to the children that you will have someday. And it's our responsibility and it's our duty to reject this. Now, when I say reject the transgender ideology, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not by any means talking about rejecting transgender individuals. Gender dysphoria is a real thing. It's a mental disorder, and I say that because that's the scientific, medically accurate way to describe the psychological phenomenon when you feel that you are born into the wrong body. It is in the medical textbooks, the psychological medical textbooks. That's a very real thing, and I cannot imagine the burden that it must feel like to suffer from that medical condition. But when I say we need to reject the transgender ideology, I'm not talking about rejecting the reality of gender dysphoria. I'm talking about rejecting the agenda that says that the way to handle or the way to treat these people with compassion or the way to treat these people medically is to indulge them in their mental illness versus gently and boldly speaking the truth to them and being defenders against public policy in the same area. So just so we know from the outset, when I say rejecting the ideology, I'm talking about the politics and the policy of the thing. I'm not talking about the individuals. We should love and care for these individuals. We should show them compassion. We should show them tolerance and inclusion because they are people, God's children, just like you and I. And just because they suffer from a certain medical condition renders them no less valuable in God's eyes or in ours. So again, I just want to make that very clear, because I'm going to say so strongly again that we must reject the political transgender ideology. And so I want to talk too about, I don't know if you guys remember this story. It might have been a couple years ago before you were politically active. But do any of you remember the story of the 7-year-old boy from Texas named James Younger? Okay, I want to tell you this story. 2 of you do. Wow. I'm very impressed. Very, very impressed. So James Younger was a 7-year-old boy who, his parents were divorced, and his parents were in the midst of a custody battle for who would get to make decisions about his life. And his mother claimed that this 7-year-old child was transgender. And the father said, no, he's not transgender. But the mother wanted the father to acquiesce to her prescribed medical treatment, which was to transition this little boy into a girl. And she wanted the father to pay for it. Now, the controversy here is that, well, this is a 7-year-old girl or a 7-year-old boy, but also that the father said, and there was video evidence that showed that the mother had been encouraging this little boy to identify as a girl since he was as young as 3 years old. She was engaging in what I would consider very abusive behavior. She was dressing him in dresses, and not the way that we all dressed our little brothers in dresses. I'm talking about actually telling him that he was a girl, withholding love from him, doing other basically unspeakable, psychologically abusive things to get him to say that he was a girl because she wanted to virtue signal. She wanted the accolades that she believed that she would get if her child was transgender. And so this was a pretty big deal 2 or 3 years ago in our country. This was a widely debated, a hot topic, if you will, because this little boy, when he was with his father, he wanted to be called James. And when he was with his mother forced him to be called Luna and to be treated like a girl. Now, this is actually still an ongoing litigation that's happening in the state of Texas. You don't hear as much about it now because the court has clamped down on what the father is allowed to talk about from the media. But from what we know about this case, we know one thing very clearly, that what this mother is doing to this little boy is child abuse. It's not her being tolerant. It's not her helping him be his authentic self or telling his truth or whatever phraseology they want to use. The transgender ideology that she's pushing on him is child abuse. And you and I must, for the sake of these little boys and girls across the country, for the sake of our brothers and sisters, for the sake of our classmates in school, for the sake of our children that are to be, for the sake of my daughter who's 9 months, we must fight back against the transgender ideology, which is abusive. And the way that we do that is by acknowledging the reality of the situation. We do it gently and we do it with respect. But we have to understand the severity of what's going on in order to be able to push back against this. And we have to do so with facts and with compassion. And when I say with facts, what I mean by that is there are scientific studies that show that children that suffer from gender dysphoria, who feel this disassociation with their own gender or their own body, 80 to 95% of them, so the vast, vast, vast majority of them, this actually takes care of itself on its own. It goes away by the time they reach puberty, by the time they reach adulthood, by the time they're 18 years old. So what you would think would be the medically prescribed thing to do would be to get the child counseling that would help guide them to that outcome, that desired outcome. But no, we have this ideology that we're up against, and perhaps the root of this ideology, why it came into being, is a topic for a different day. But the fact remains, this ideology exists from the left, where they want us to not just tolerate people choosing to live a life differently than we might choose to live ourselves. They want us to embrace this, and they want to punish us if we don't want that for our families. So again, I know this is a serious topic. I know it's a somber topic, but you guys are the next generation of freedom fighters. You guys, by being here tonight, by spending this time at this conference, you've proved to, thought leaders and politicians and other conservatives in the movement across the country that you are our future. You are going to be what happens to our country, because that is in your hands. And so you have to recognize, or I encourage you to recognize, I plead with you to recognize some of the most serious issues that face our nation. And this is one of the most serious issues. Because one of the arguments that the left will tell you when they're pushing this transgender ideology is they'll say, well, these children who have gender dysphoria will commit suicide if they aren't transitioned. In fact, there was a story out of my hometown in Cincinnati and in the state of Ohio where parents actually lost custody of their 17-year-old daughter. Their 17-year-old daughter had gender dysphoria, and a judge took her away from the parents because the parents said, you know what? She has other serious mental health issues. We want her to wait until she's an adult to decide this for herself. And so we're not going to go forward with, a transition of genders at this time. The daughter threatened to commit suicide. And as a result, the judge took the daughter away from the parents and gave custody to someone who would facilitate that transition. Which, again, imagine this happening to your sisters and brothers. Imagine, a cousin or a friend dealing with this and the parents losing the right to make decisions about their own child's healthcare. Imagine if your parents weren't allowed to help you make decisions about your own healthcare, but put you in the custody of someone else who was making decisions not based off of your well-being, but based on the political agenda of someone who doesn't even know you. That's a pretty heavy thing to think about, isn't it? Well, that's what's happening at the hands of this transgender ideology. And I don't need to tell the young women in this room, because I think we all feel the same way, and especially for you guys, because this is happening in your locker rooms. But the idea that a biological male can come into your locker room at school or come into your bathroom at school just because he says he's a woman, just because he claims that that's his identity, that's pretty scary. I know it's scary to me, and I'm not even the one that's in high school anymore. You guys, do you want males in your bathroom? No. And the boys, it's not the same physical threat to the men, but I would say the men in this room don't want females in their locker room, in their bathroom either, because it's a violation of privacy. But for women, it's not just a violation of privacy, it's an actual danger. So again, this is not hypothetical. So in Loudoun County, Virginia right now, they had instituted a gender neutral bathroom policy in the school district there against the wishes of a lot of parents there. And what happened is a male who wore a skirt and said that he identified as a female went into that bathroom and he sexually assaulted a 9th grader, a 14-year-old. He sexually assaulted her. And then when the school found out, and I know I can see the looks on your faces, you should be horrified. This is horrifying. And the reason that it's okay to be horrified right now is because we have to understand the severity of what's happening in order to know our own strength in fighting back against this. So when the school was notified about this sexual assault, the father of the girl who was sexually assaulted came to the school. And as you might imagine, he was irate. He was devastated for his daughter, and he was yelling. He was yelling profanities, as he should, at the school administrators who facilitated a policy that allowed this to happen. I think any good father would do the same thing. And the school called the police on the father for shouting profanities instead of calling the police on the rapist. The rapist was allowed to go back to school, and he committed another sexual assault after he was allowed to go back to the school. And this wasn't handled. It wasn't handled until journalists at the Daily Wire broke this story last week. Last week, this happened months ago. This is an example of the transgender ideology. So when you hear the left say, this is about tolerance, this is about inclusion, this is about compassion, you say, yes, it is. It's also about safety. It's about reality, and it's about women's rights. It's about protecting women. We can be tolerant and compassionate and inclusive of everybody, no matter what mental health status they have, while also protecting women. This is what we're up against. This is what the transgender ideology is. And the left betrays themselves as well when they say that it's about tolerance. It's really not about tolerance. It's not about freedom of expression. It's actually the opposite of that. It's anti-free speech. It's speech control and it's thought control. Again, in my state of Ohio, my home state of Ohio, and I like to use Ohio as examples because they have so many good things, but also so many bad things. It's why they're a swing state. But a boy in 6th grade in Ohio was actually sent to the principal's office during school. He was threatened with suspension for bullying, but what he actually did that had the accusation of being bullying was he said there were only 2 genders. That's all he said. It was a discussion in class about the transgender ideology, about the biology of the thing, and he said, listen, there are only 2 genders, and he was sent to the principal's office for it. So if we're talking about tolerance and we're talking about inclusion, clearly his viewpoints weren't tolerated and they weren't included in the school. Again, it's always good to have ammunition to know that when the left makes a claim, especially a claim that's as vague as tolerance and inclusion and compassion, that they're ignoring all 3 of those things. They're ignoring tolerance of science. They're ignoring tolerance of conservatism. They're ignoring inclusion of science, and they're ignoring compassion towards women who are harmed by this. There's also a matter here of religious freedom. And I know from speaking at these conferences in the past that a great number of you are men and women, young men and women of faith. And that to me is so encouraging. I'm always open about the fact that I'm a practicing Catholic. It informs not only my personal life, but it informs my politics as well. And I'm going to go off on a tangent here for a second, but lest anyone ever tell you that you shouldn't mix politics and religion, that there's this separation of church and state, they're wrong. They're absolutely wrong. Your faith should inform how you make decisions and your judgment and what policies you stand for. And so, thank you. And so the transgender ideology is also a threat to the religious freedom of all of those of us who believe that God ordained us as male and female, and that you can't just switch no matter what you do to your body, no matter what you feel like in your head. But there's a matter of religious freedom in the workplace as well. There's a woman who runs a skincare boutique in Canada who was forced to close her business because she declined to perform waxing services on the private areas of a person who claimed to be a woman but was not. And she declined to perform that waxing service, and because she said that it violated her religion to do so. And she was sued for it, and she was forced to close down her business because she wouldn't do that, because it was against her religious beliefs to do that. So again, you're talking about tolerance, you're talking about inclusion, you're talking about compassion here. The reality is that's not what the transgender ideology is about at all. And it doesn't, by the way, the ideology isn't also about the best interest of the people who suffer from gender dysphoria, because you all know the basics of what a transition is. Not to get too graphic or detailed, but there's the social transition where you start dressing, cutting your hair like the other gender, and then there's the surgical transition. Well, the surgical transition, the secondary part, that's the part that they say, oh, well, it lowers your suicide risk if you go through with this, if you have gender dysphoria. Actually, there have been studies done internationally, specifically in Europe and Scandinavia, that shows that a year after the transition surgery, suicide rates remain static, which means they remain the same as preoperative rates. So this isn't about the well-being. This isn't about the well-being of the individual either. Not at all. Not by any stretch. It is, of course, about control over society, and the people who are suffering from gender dysphoria are the pawns in this ideology. They're not the ones whose rights are being fought for. They're not the ones who are being defended. They're not the vanguards of the next civil rights, I think is what the latest phrase is. They're not the vanguards of the next civil rights movement here. No, they're victims here. They are being victimized. They're being victimized when they're already in a vulnerable position by the left, who wants to use them to push their own political agenda. And so again, it's up to you and I to push back on this, because if we don't, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, playing by the premise of the left or accepting the premise of the left, what comes next? What's after transgender? If we, for the sake of argument, accept the idea that a man can be a woman just because he says so, or just because he feels so, or just because he identifies so, then what's next? If we accept transgender, what do we have next? Transabled, where someone identifies as disabled even when they're not, and we accept that? What's after transabled? Do we have trans species? Someone identifies as a dog. Are they? Well, by the logic of the left, why the heck not? So, you think this is a joke? Both of those two things that I mentioned, there are actually nutcases in our country who are making the claims that they're transabled and trans species. Oh yeah, you thought I was joking. No, I'm not joking. There's also, and this is so weird, I probably shouldn't even tell this story to high schoolers. There's a grown man who says that he's trans-aged. He's 40 years old or something along the likes, and he wants to go to kindergarten. Of course he's a predator. Of course we're laughing because it's so absurd, but it's actually not funny, because by the logic of the left, why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't he go to kindergarten? On what grounds could we deny him the right to go to kindergarten if that's who he is authentically, if that's what he feels and that's how he identifies? So, as I said, the only reason to take it down these slippery slopes is because they're really, well, if you sit at the top of a slippery hill too long, you just might slide down it. Okay, so it's up to us to fight back on this. And as we know, it simply defies objective truth. I mean, we know that there are two genders. We know that men are men and women are women, and you can't switch your gender no matter how much you want to. And this is what I would say. And this is specific to your generation. This isn't even true of my generation anymore. Every generation has their social, political, and even social, sexual, political battle, right? Every single generation has the battle that they have to fight in this area. In the 1960s, it was the sexual revolution. It was, birth control and free love. In the 1970s, it was the legalization of abortion on demand. In the 1980s, it was no-fault divorce. Do you see the pattern here of these social, sexual, cultural issues? In the 1990s, it was the proliferation of online pornography, which before the 1990s was not a thing. In the 2000s, it was the hookup culture on college campuses. In the 2010s, it was the fight over gay marriage and traditional marriage and whether a court can redefine that. And now in the 2020s, it's your turn. You're up to bat. It's your turn to fight back against these social, sexual, cultural issues. And the issue that you must fight against to protect our country is the transgender ideology. This is up to you. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about this topic tonight is not because this is, the typical red meat, rah, rah, rah topic. It's not. It's a heavy topic. It's a difficult topic. It's an uncomfortable topic. It can be a painful topic. But this is one of those issues that if the left wins, there will be no turning back. And so we can't let them win. We can't let them take over objective reality. We can't let them take over parental rights. We can't let them take over biology and science. We can't let them take over religion. We can't let them take over women. And I'm talking about both the identity of women and the safety of women, because if we do, then what do we have left? Nothing. We have no rights. We have no freedoms. We have no safety and security. And you might be sitting here thinking, well, this is the worst topic that I can possibly think of to talk about in high school or to talk about as I consider going into college. I'm going to immediately be labeled a bigot. Here's what I would say. Yes, you will. It is important. It is important. And just because someone calls you a bigot doesn't mean it's true. But you can expect to be called a bigot. Because if you're fighting the fight, it doesn't matter what topic you're talking about, someone will call you a name for it, even if you're fighting respectfully, even if you're fighting civilly, even if you're fighting for what is objectively true and good and just and right. But that's okay. That's okay if someone calls you that name, as long as you are acting in good faith, as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you're standing up for what's right. And that's why it's so important for you to find community here, for you to bolster the intellectual side of the conservative movement and the fight, learn about why we believe what we believe, not just what we believe. If you foster community and you foster your intellect and you foster family and you foster your close friendships, then you'll be equipped. You foster your faith communities, you'll be equipped when you begin to fight these very difficult, very challenging, very, very critically important fights. You'll be equipped to do so even in the face of the hatred that you will receive. And again, that's why I wanted to talk about this with you guys specifically tonight, because there's no other group of young people that I can think of in the entire United States who is better equipped to go out into the world and fight this fight, to be the freedom fighters that will prevent this ideology from taking over our nation. Because if we don't fight this, then children like James Younger will be abused. The medical community will be weaponized. Women in locker rooms will be endangered. In bathrooms, we'll lose our privacy. Parents will lose our kids. Siblings will lose their brothers and sisters. Biological women, just in and of themselves, will become obsolete. I mean, we see that happening in sports right now. Religious people's rights will be trampled. Delusion, and that's what it is, will be codified into law. We won't be allowed to speak out against it. Regret of these surgeries, 11% of transgender women regret their surgery so much that they actually detransition back to their original gender. Regret will be ignored. You'll be called transphobic just to mention it. And objective truth will be obliterated. And in the process, government will grow so big and so powerful, we won't have any capacity as conservatives or as Christians or as free-thinking, scientific, independent-minded people to fight back against this. And so my message to you tonight is do not be afraid to fight. Do not be afraid to speak reality. Do not be afraid to be strong and gentle and kind and truthful and compassionate. And remember that compassion and tolerance and inclusion, remember what they really mean. And that it's not just one transgender person who wants to be included in a sport. That's not what the fight's really about. The fight is about truth and the future of our nation, and you guys are better equipped than anybody that I know to fight this fight. And that's it. That's all I have to say tonight.
All right. Thank you.
That's what I always hope happens at the end of that speech. I don't want people to be cheering and rah, rah, rahing. I want it to be silent as a pin drop, because I know that means that you guys heard that and that you guys are going to go out and fight this fight, and that makes me so proud of you. Do you guys want to do questions?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Gary.
Hi, Gary.
I'm homeschooled.
Great, so was I.
I don't know about that. But my question is, so the field that I want to work in, I already know has a lot of, I'm not going to say deranged, but, not in their right minds, people that are, like, say that they want to be, oh, I'm they, them, or I'm not, what I'm supposed to be. And, like, how should I really not be treating, but, like, informing them about, like, what they're doing wrong. And then also I want to say that what I realize a lot about them is that they usually have some sort of, like, mental disorder, like maybe, like, depression, insomnia. They always have something. When they choose to do it, they always have something in that field, which is, like, I found, it's really weird and sad.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how I'm supposed to, like, inform them about, like, what's right.
Well, what field are you talking about?
It's called esports. I know it's kind of weird, but, like, a lot of people are, like, you can't do anything against that, or you immediately, you're out. You can't really get into it. And
interesting. So you're correct when you say that most people who suffer from gender dysphoria have, it's the scientific term for it, or the medical term for it, is a comorbidity, meaning they have a simultaneous diagnosis of another mental illness. And that usually informs the gender dysphoria. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't unpack the origin of everyone's gender dysphoria, but you're correct that there's usually a comorbidity. So the first thing that I would say is, did you notice that when I was talking about Dr. Rachel Levine, I didn't use any pronouns? Did you guys notice that? So when you're talking directly to a person who identifies as transgender, I mean, I'm not going to use your pronouns because you don't do that when you're talking directly to a person. You do that when you're talking about someone. So you shouldn't really be in a situation unless someone's confronting you directly saying, why won't you use so-and-so pronouns? You shouldn't be in a position where you have to feel that awkwardness of not wanting to be directly rude to their face, but not wanting to betray biology or reality. So you should be able to, if you're careful with your words, not use any pronouns at all. And then, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you're talking just about working with other people whose beliefs are different or who are doing things that you believe are wrong or unhealthy or destructive, I would say a couple things. First of all, make sure that you're treating them as a fellow brother and sister in Christ first, because one of the things that will surprise you the most is their preconceived notions about how they expect a conservative to treat them. And so what you want to do is you want to surprise them. You want to treat them with genuine love and respect and dignity and compassion. And then after that's been established, if the conversation ever comes up, which it may not in the workplace, because sometimes that's just not appropriate for a coworker, but the first thing that you can do is just treat them with respect. And then if ever there is a chance to discuss that sort of thing, you would have to be very careful about that. It probably wouldn't be appropriate in the actual office to do that, but you can think about asking about the biology of the thing, or I don't know truly if a coworker is qualified to help someone unpack where the source of their gender dysphoria comes from. So I guess my best advice would just be show them what the love of Christ is through you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from Buchanan High School, and my question is, like, I have friends who suffer from gender dysphoria and are also, like, really depressed and, like, have mental health issues. So how would I, like, confront them on this without, like, making them more depressed and think that I hate them?
Right. Well, it's a very difficult thing to do. Again, part of my answer would be a repeat of what I just said, is make sure that you're treating them with dignity and respect and making sure that you're trying to be a channel of God's love to them. I don't know how they handle their mental health, whether they have sought help for that, whether they seek counseling. But if they haven't, that might be somewhere to start, not with the gender dysphoria, but just saying, I notice that, you're depressed. I don't know if you guys openly converse about that, but if so, you can maybe recommend that they seek a counselor about that. And if they're open to that, you can help guide them towards a counselor that may help them seek reality as well. I don't know that having a close friend and just starting to drop the facts about the transgender ideology is the way to go. I would say it is probably not the way to go, because as I said before, these are the people who are suffering from a real mental disorder, and they're the ones being victimized by people in politics who are using them as pawns for a larger governmental agenda. And so you want to make sure that you're not using that individual just for the crossfire of the political fight as well. You want to guide them maybe to a pastor or a faith leader or a wise adult who can help guide them to the mental health that they need. And that's probably the best that you can do.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Isaac Spencer. I represent American Heritage Academy. And so I know you were talking about how to treat them with love and that sort of stuff. But I'm just curious about, you see a lot of anger from them sometimes, from the transgender agenda. And I'm just curious about how, when the conversation starts to get angry, when you get into that moment, how you can address the anger and try to change it, or how the conversation should move through from there.
Sure. Are you talking about actual individuals who suffer from gender dysphoria, or are you talking about people who are supposedly supportive of the transgender political agenda?
I think more of the supportive of the political agenda.
Okay, so when you get to that point, then you can talk more about the politics. You can talk more about the stories that we were just discussing. You can talk more about the facts. You can what I do in those conversations when I'm talking to someone who has a very opposing viewpoint of mine is I don't actually drop facts. I don't talk about the statistics. I just ask them questions. I actually it's hard for me, as you know. I like to talk. I make a concerted effort. Jay, hey, I can see you smiling in the back. Yes, he directs my show. I make a concerted effort actually to keep my mouth shut and just ask a very small, very narrow question. So you can ask, well, what is your definition of a woman? Or does a transition actually help with suicide rates? Is transitioning curative? You can ask some of these questions that you already know the answer to that they maybe hadn't thought of, but by asking the question and having them answer, it might start that train of thought in their mind, even if they don't change their mind on the spot, which they probably won't. Most people don't. It might plant that seed that causes them to do more research. So doesn't that endanger women? Doesn't that endanger young girls in high school, in locker rooms? Isn't that unfair to women in sports? All the way up to the Olympics, when there was that Olympic weightlifter from New Zealand who was a biological male transitioned to a woman, that person got a spot on the women's team, depriving an actual woman of the opportunity to compete in the Olympics. You can ask, do you think that's fair? You can, of course it's not, obviously, but you can ask some of these, what we would consider relatively obvious questions to just try to start that train of thought in their mind. And that's probably the best way to begin a truly productive discussion versus just, kind of boxing over the politics of the thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello,
Hi.
My name is Nathan Horsel, and I'm homeschooled from Franklin, Tennessee. And recently, I actually went to a summer camp here in Santa Barbara. It was a sleepaway camp at a local school. And one of the things that frustrated me was I was doing a model Congress camp. And I was surrounded by a lot of very politically minded peers, a lot of very left-wing peers, which was interesting because the school said it has a complete appreciation of all different opinions, and though that was wrong. And I was having kind of I try my very best to have a very respectful debate, and with a peer, and they seemed to and I kept bringing up gender and I said two genders, male and female, and they kept bringing up this spectrum. And it's very difficult to debate with someone who doesn't really care about facts, who just lives the slogan. And I was just wondering if you have any tips for someone who's debating someone who is so locked in their own truth, and how to have a constructive debate from that?
Yeah, and that's a really, really good question, because that's not just something that you dealt with at your sleepaway camp. This is actually something that our entire nation is dealing with on a national level. This is the difference between Republicans and Democrats right now. It's not just a matter like it was 100 years ago, where we had similar goals but different ways to achieve those goals, and we kind of bickered over which way we would achieve those goals. No, now we have fundamentally different definitions of reality, of what is good and what is bad and what is right and what is wrong and what is male and what is female. And so two things I would say. When you're in a one-on-one debate with someone who obviously has a completely different premise than you, remember that you're not going to change that person's mind right there. That the debate is happening for the benefit of whoever's listening, because whoever's listening is able to actually listen, versus the person that you're debating is just very intent on getting their arguments out and making sure to defend their stance and save face on their arguments. So they're probably not going to change their mind. But if you make a compelling argument, someone else who's listening might have their minds changed, or you might plant that seed. But the other really interesting point that you bring up that I think is very important to touch on is this is actually why I don't think compromise is a virtue. So this is an idea in both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party that we need people in Washington to stop bickering. We need people to just start getting along and come together for the common good. And I reject this idea because I don't think there's any virtue in compromise just in and of itself. Like the act of compromise, there's nothing good or bad about it. It's just compromise. It's neutral. It depends on what you're compromising, whether it is a good thing or a bad thing. And so when what is on the chopping block, when what you might compromise is the very principles on which this country is founded are biology or science or reality, you shouldn't compromise. You should stand absolutely strong and not cave just because someone wants you to meet them in the middle. But if the middle means that you're giving up something that is good and true and just, then your compromise is actually bad. And I think this is something that conservatives need to understand more, because we need to stand our ground on some of these issues and not think, well, what's the solution that we can mutually agree upon, when any slide, any compromise would actually be, well, compromising our principles.
Thank you very much. Let's go, Brandon.
Hi, my name is Melissa. I'm homeschooled from Clovis, California. I was just wondering, and I apologize, this is a little off topic. What is the best way to respectfully convince someone to become pro-life, especially when they don't believe in God?
Great question. Totally fine that it's off topic. The best way to convince people is first with two questions. When does life begin? And then once you've dealt with that, if life begins at conception, which we know, not just from a religious standpoint, but from a medical and scientific standpoint, it does. If life begins at conception, then what right do we have to end that life? So going back to the first question, when does life begin? There was a really interesting study that was done, and I know that's a little misleading sometimes to say interesting and study in the same word. But there was an interesting study done by a PhD student at the University of Chicago who actually did a scientific survey on who people think is the authority to answer the question, when does life begin? Because you and I might think, oh, well, it says in the Bible, right? But what about non-religious people? So he conducted the scientific survey of people of all faith backgrounds, some people without faith, and asked them, who do you think, who would you believe if they said, who's the authority on this question? And everybody answered, 95% of people answered, well, academic biologists, the scientists who are specialized in biology are the authority on this topic. So then he did a secondary scientific survey where he asked academic biologists, not just in our country, but all around the world, when does a human life begin? And again, 95% of academic biologists said a human life begins from the moment of conception. The other 5%, I believe, said, are you an effing Christian? And is this a Trump thing? And real scientific answers right there. But those types of stories, I think, are very instrumental in changing people's lives. We're also the refrigerator door generation, meaning we see all of our brothers and sisters' ultrasounds, or my child's ultrasound on our refrigerator door. We can see that that's a human person inside their mother's womb. I mean, you can show them live action videos to show them, the development of a baby from the moment of conception and how that's obviously a human person. And then you can eventually get into what is abortion. It's not just this euphemistic termination or content of pregnancy that you're getting rid of, removal of. You can get into, it can be kind of gruesome, what an abortion actually is. And when you target those questions, the when does life begin, what right do we have to end that person's life, and what is an abortion, you will find people's minds will change. Not immediately, but eventually.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dorina Pajerny, and I go to Clovis High School. And my main question was kind of more specifically, how do you keep the peace around these kind of, like, I guess, debates, especially when the people that you're talking with do have a locked truth or are tied to it emotionally, like they have a specific hurt from it? Because I do go to a public school, and right now things are very hostile, and a lot of the, when talking to them, I've noticed that a lot of the arguments or just like issues is that they've been either hurt from it, and that's why they are the way that they are, or it's just very hard to reach them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's true in almost every issue in adult life, that people's irrational viewpoints are due to some hurt. So it's something that if you find an adult who's mastered how to navigate someone else who's been emotionally hurt, then that person's going to make $1 billion probably off of that. So I don't have the perfect answer to that, but what I would say is, listen to them. Listen to them, not in the sense that you're accepting what they say as reality, but sometimes the way that someone can hear something is first by saying what they need to be said. Because when we come to a conversation with an agenda, we all have in our minds all these cool and pithy things that we want to say. We have these list of bulleted talking points, these comebacks that we want to make, and we're not really actively listening until we've said everything that we needed to say. And so one of the things that I've tried to do, and this is actually true even in professional debates, is sometimes I try to be quiet at first and let them say everything that they have to say. Like every point. I don't interrupt when they say ridiculous things. I don't contradict when they're wrong. I just be quiet and let them go on a spiel for 2 or 3 minutes and get everything out of their system. And then I start asking those small little questions. Because once they're void of all of those preconceived talking points, they might actually be able to process what you're saying. Because it is really toxic. It's actually more toxic in high school for you guys than it was 15 years ago when I was in high school. Much more toxic, because back then conservatives and liberals just fought with each other. We just argued with each other. We just, called each other names on Facebook maybe. And now liberals don't even want to do that. They want you canceled if you have a difference of opinion at all. And so I would encourage you not only to engage in these debate tactics, but try to set up events, within your school where you go back to that almost old-fashioned type of debate, where you have these round tables where you say, we want to hear your perspective too, not just come and be convinced by mine, but we want to hear your perspective too, and see if you can do it in a civil way. See if you can do it in a respectful way where they see that there's some value in being there as well and making their point heard and listening to what you have to say too.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Awen Frankenfield. I go to Veritas Scholars Academy. My question for you is, how would you recommend that we deal with people who really kind of just ignore basic biology?
Well, ask them to define a woman. Ask them what their definition is. It's actually very interesting if you're ever talking about the transgender ideology with anyone. If you ask that basic question, well, what is a woman? They don't have an answer. Even in answer to that question, they will get agitated. Not that your purpose is to agitate them, it's not, but they don't have an answer to that question. And then ask them, do you think that the women's rights movement is pointless? Do you think that women should be obsolete? Or what does this render women to be if we're erasing the very biological reality of what it means to be a woman? And if I know a student just asked about the spectrum, if they talk about the spectrum, ask for a definition of what that means. Ask for them to define some of the scenarios that would be reality if we were to accept this premise. Well, can someone change their identity, one day to the next? How do you know where someone is on this spectrum if it's not related to biology and DNA? Ask some of these questions. The best thing that you can do to start productive conversations is ask some questions. And it's okay to think about, ahead of these debates, it's okay to think about what questions you think would spark the debate, so that when you say, okay, this topic came up, this is the question that I think would really, benefit, because it can benefit the conversation, because it can be hard on the fly to know what question to ask. So you can think critically about what the flaws in their arguments are, so that you can formulate those questions so that you're prepared when you get into a situation like that.
Thank you for your time.
Hello, my name is Kyle Fernside. I am homeschooled through SBFA, and I'm from LA. My question is, you've been talking about listening to people with transgender ideologies, but how do you get them to listen?
Well, it depends. As I said before, it depends on if you're talking about people who suffer from gender dysphoria versus the political activists who are victimizing the people who suffer from gender dysphoria. So the people who suffer from gender dysphoria, the first thing that you need to do is treat them as a child of God, right? Because you're not just going to go up to them and start telling them that they're wrong and telling them that they're not the way that they feel and blah, blah, blah. They're not going to listen to you if that's the case. First, you have to, treat them with the dignity and the respect that they deserve as a human being. And then after that, you can try to gently guide them to get the counseling, the professional counseling that they need. That's very different than talking to the political activists. Not that you shouldn't treat them respectfully too, but it's two very different things when you're just talking to an everyday liberal who is trying to deny gender versus someone who is suffering from a mental disorder. So if you're talking about the liberals, I mean, I'm just going to echo what I said before. You start by asking the basic questions. What is a man? Define a woman. How does this, how does this harm biological women, both their safety and the very idea of being a biological woman? How does this harm society? Isn't there objective truth? What is the end of this ideology? What's the limiting principle on this? If you're talking about the political activists who are engaging in this, in a push for this agenda, then start by asking a question. And if you're talking about the transgender or the people who suffer from gender dysphoria, start by being a beacon of Christ first.
All right, thank you.
My name is Destiny Verrett, and I'm from South Bay Faith Academy. And I was wondering, how do you talk to a family member who is either considering transitioning or already has, but they don't really want to listen to what you have to say?
Are they male or female?
Either, both.
Well, if they're female, then give them Abigail Schreier's book. Have you read Abigail Schreier's book?
No.
Okay, it's really, really interesting. Written, she's not even conservative, by the way, so it's not going to be something that maybe a family member would immediately discard. You can just offer them her book and say, listen, if you're considering a life-changing, a life-altering, forever transition, I want you to be as educated about it as possible, and I really encourage you to read this book. I found it very illuminating. Dr. Ryan Anderson also wrote a really good book. That talks about the science, that talks about the statistics, that talks about all the studies about this. And if someone's not willing to have a conversation with you, sometimes they're willing to read something, especially if they can do so in the privacy of their own room or their own home or where they don't feel like someone's looking over their shoulder. I know that's what I've done in situations where the in-person conversation might not have been as conducive. I've just gifted them books or sent them things and said, hey, I really want you to be as educated as possible so that you really know what you're doing if you're going to go through with this. And then reading that stuff, it's pretty hard to go through with it if you're willing to read that. So the two authors are Abigail Schreier and Dr. Ryan Anderson.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course.
Hello, my name is Megan Richardson, and I'm homeschooled from Palm Desert, California. My question is, we have on the left these two opposing ideologies, one being that if you question any sort of rape allegations from a woman or anything like that, you're automatically a horrible person. But also, if you question rape allegations from, someone who's claiming to be a woman against another girl, or like you brought up, how do we navigate looking at those two ideas when the left tries to hold both of them at the same time?
Well, you can call out the hypocrisy in exactly the way that you just did. You can say, well, you're applying two different standards to the same, to what should be the same scenario here. Either we believe all women without proof, or we don't. But you can't apply different standards based on the different scenarios. But we shouldn't believe all women just for the sake of believing all women. Every man who has an allegation lodged against him is not guilty of that allegation. We know that there's been false allegations, and there always have and there always will be. And every person who has an allegation made against them is entitled to due process in our country, whether that's a college student, a high school student, or whether it's, a future Supreme Court Justice of the United States. Everybody deserves that due process. And so there shouldn't be one gender believed just because there's one gender and another gender disbelieved just because they're a specific gender. We should be evaluating neutrally the allegation and the defense on both parties. And that I think that's actually a good thing that your generation needs to be talking about more, especially talking about to young men, because young men are the ones who are really on the chopping block here. If some random woman can absolutely ruin their life, they can ruin their reputation, even threaten their freedom, really, by making an unfounded accusation. men need to stand up and say, hey, wait a second, this is not what our justice system is about. And women need to stand up in defense of men who are in that vulnerable position. And you should be talking about it at your schools. You should be talking about it when you get to college. You should be asking the other side, especially males on the other side, do you think that's fair? Do you know that under the standard where there's no due process, that your life could be ruined by a false allegation from somebody crazy or somebody who doesn't like you? And ask them, do you think that's fair? Do you want to live in a country like that? And again, this might be a situation where in that moment they don't answer you, but there's not a male on earth who wants to be thrown in jail or fired from his job or kicked out of school based on a false allegation. And if he thinks that he's vulnerable to that, he's going to want the policy changed. And so that conversation is actually a very important conversation that your generation needs to have, that my generation didn't deal with the same as you guys are.
Thank you.
Of course.
All right. Thank you. That is all the time we had for questions. Thank you, Liz.
All right. Thank you. Thank you to the Young Americas Foundation. I love talking with you all. Follow me on Twitter. You know how to get in touch with me. Join me on Locals. It's our VIP community for behind-the-scenes stuff for my show. It's lizwheelershow.com/locals. Do you guys want to hang out for a bit? Yeah? Okay, let's do it.